Alright, so we're going to look at power measures in this section, and what I mean by that is how much power a voter has. And you can do this with a lot of different systems, but we're going to do it with the weighted voting that we saw in the last section. Alright, and the thing that we saw in the last section is that weights don't exactly correlate to power. If you remember, the first example in the last section gave us I think 19, is that right? 19 votes. All right. And while B and C and D and E and F did have votes, they really didn't have any power because whatever A said goes, right? The quota was 10. And so if A voted for the motion, then it passed. If A voted against, then it failed. And so obviously A, we would think, has 100% of the power, or one, as we're doing proportions, it'd be 1 of the power. And B should have 0% of the power, because whatever B voted for, it really didn't matter. A's carrying all the weights. Now, we have 19 votes, remember, so technically, of the votes, A has about 53% of the votes. And B has 4 out of 19 times 100, so 21% of the votes, roughly. Okay. So even though B has 21% of the votes, B doesn't really have any power. And the same thing goes for C, D, and E, and F. Even though they have a certain percentage of the votes, they don't have any power. So weights don't directly correlate to power. All right, now there's 3 ways to measure power, to talk about power. One of them is just by straight weights, and we see kind of the downfall of that from the previous slide. B had 21% of the weight, but no influence over what things say. And there's 2 other fairly famous ways to measure power. There's the Banzhaf power index and the Shapley-Shubik power index. We're going to mainly concern ourselves with this first one, okay? The Banzhaf power index, okay? I'll mention the Shapley-Shubik power index, but we're going to work with the Banzhaf right now. All right, so here's what's going to happen. Basically, those critical, the critical players in the winning coalitions is what's going to matter, all right, in the Banzhaf power index, okay? So basically, we're going to correlate how often a voter is a critical player, or how often the voter was a critical player, okay? So here's the process. You count you take a voter, let's say voter A, and you count in all of the winning coalitions, how many times was A winning or a critical player? All right. Now that's going to be what's called the critical count, the number of times A is a critical player in any of these winning coalitions. So you got to write down winning coalitions, decide whether A is a critical player, how many times in those, and then you do that for every single voter. Okay? And so you sum all of the critical counts for all the voters, and the Banzhaf power index is the critical count of whatever voter it is divided by the sum of all of the critical counts. Okay? So if we're doing it for A, this would be the critical count of A divided by the critical count of A plus the critical count of B plus the critical count of C, and so on and so forth. All right? So that's the Banzhaf power index. So let's take an example here. We have A, B, C, and D. All right, now I'm going to do this one fairly quickly. Notice that A, B, C, and D all have different weights. And we're saying here that the quota is 21. All right. So let's start out by trying to find all of the winning coalitions. This is how you always should start out any Banzhaf power index. List out all of the winning coalitions, all right? So if you look at this, if you do any one single person, none of them reach 21. So there's no single person coalitions that win. Two coalitions, well, A and B doesn't work. A and C doesn't work. A and D doesn't work. None of those reach 21s. But notice B, C, and B, D, and C, D all reach 21. So basically, as long as it's a coalition of two people and one of the people is not A, B, C, B, D, C, D, then we have a winning coalition. All right? And it turns out in this case, any three people work. So if you did A, B, and C, or if you did A, C, and D, or right, any three of these numbers add up to 21. Now, previous time I didn't write all those, so I'm going to write all the threes. So you have A, B, C. We have A, B, D. We have A, C, D. And we have B, C, D. That's all the three-person coalitions. And then obviously if everybody votes for it, if A, B, C, and D vote for it, then that's a winning coalition. Okay? So now that I have all the winning coalitions, I need to figure out how many times each voter was a critical player. So what I've done here is I've listed out the winning coalitions in a table form. Okay? And now I'm going to count in all of these which times A was a critical player. Now, notice that in this top one, in the BC version, okay, A is not going to be critical because it's not even in there. I can't delete it. Same thing, anytime A is not in one of these things, A can't be critical. All right? But take a look at A, B, C. Okay? Is A critical there? Well, if I delete it, I'm left with BC. BC would have still won. So A is not critical there. So let me just fill in zeros every time A is not critical. All right, A, B, D. Well, B and D would have won, so A is not critical. In other words, what you're doing is you're going through and you're deleting every time you see an A and asking yourself, would that still have won? All right, C, D would have still won. So A, therefore, is not critical. B, D, C doesn't have A in it, so obviously A can't be critical if it's not there. And then A, B, C, D, if you delete A, you get B, C, D, that still wins. Okay? So A is never critical. How about B? Well, in this top one, if I delete B, C is there. C does not win. So B is critical here. So I'm going to list a 1 every time B is critical. B, D, if I eliminate B, it's critical. I have C, D, B's not in there, so it can't be critical if it's not in there. If I delete B from this guy, A, C is remaining. A and C do not win, so B is critical. If I delete B, I get A and D, that doesn't win, so B is critical. A, C, D, that doesn't have B in it. If I delete B from here, from B, C, D, well, C, D still wins. So B was not critical in that winning coalition. And for a similar reason, if I delete B here, A, C, D still wins. So B is not critical in that coalition. Okay? So again, you go through this with every single voter. C is critical there. C is critical there because when I delete it, D doesn't work. A, B doesn't work, so C is critical there. C is critical here because AD does not work. C is not critical because BD does work. And C is not critical here because ABD doesn't work. So, or excuse me, still works. So 0, 0, C was critical there. Obviously, C is not critical. Critical here. critical here, critical here. All right, so let's just go through D again. D, if it's non-existent there, it's not critical. Yes, it's critical in that one. Yes, it's critical in that one. No. Yes. Yes. No. No. All right? So you can see all of the critical counts for these guys. B is critical 4 times. C is critical 4 times. D is critical 4 times. And A is never critical. All right, so the critical counts 0, 4, 4, 4. That gives us a total sum of the critical counts of 12. So the Banzhaf power is 0 out of 12, 4 out of 12, 4 out of 12, and 4 out of 12 for each of the corresponding voters. Now, I want to say this about the Banzhaf power index and how you write this on your test or something. You do not need to reduce these. In fact, I'd prefer it if you leave it as 4 out of 12 rather than trying to reduce that to 1/3. Okay? And 0 out of 12, I'm not concerned if you write 0 or 0 out of 12, it's the same thing. But you don't need to reduce these. Okay? You don't need to take an extra step. It's perfectly fine to leave those as 4 out of 12s. All right, so here's a different voting scenario. Here we have 4 people, and we're going to assume that we have a quota of 22. So what I want you guys to do is to list out all of the winning coalitions. So push pause on the video, list out all the winning coalitions, and then we're going to move to the next slide, and after we do that, and I'll have you guys calculate the Banzhaf power indices. All right, so hopefully you've done that. Winning coalitions, in this case, well, if the quota is 22, A and B win. No singles win. A and B. A and C win. A and D win. So A and B, A and C, A and D win. B and C do not win. B and D do not win. C and D do not win. So those 3, A, B, A, C, A, D, are all the winning coalitions with 2 voters. With 3 voters, obviously we can do this A, B, C. If A is in there and B and D, they win. If there's A and C and D, then they win. And B, C, and D also win. And then if you put all the voters together, A, B, C, and D, they also win. So those are your 8 winning coalitions. All right, so I've written in all of the winning coalitions in this slide. Obviously, in your notes, it's not, but you should have written those in. By the way, in this case and in the previous case, the exact size of the table had the exact number of winning coalitions. But in general, probably I'll make the table bigger than the number of winning coalitions there are. So expect to have blank spots and things like that. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go through and for each of the voters, calculate their critical count. And then once you've done that, you can, first off, push pause on the video, calculate each voter's critical count, and then come back. All right, so you should have got that A is critical here, 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 not there, not there. All right, B is critical here, not here, not here, not here, not here, not here, here, not here. Okay, C is critical, not here, yes, no, 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 yes, no. D is critical. No, no, yes, no, 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 yes, no. All right? So that's looking at it. I know I did that very fast, but again, take your time and do this right when you're taking a test or you're doing a quiz. All right? So first off, let's do a count before we go on the next slide. We have A is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. B is 2, C is 2, and D is 2. So that gives you A has a critical count of 6. Whoops, got the wrong pen. 6, 2, 2, 2. Critical count, therefore, is a 12. And the Banzhaf power is 6 out of 12, 2 out of 12, 2 out of 12, and 2 out of 12. Remember, we do not need to reduce those if we don't want to. Okay? So there's our Banzhaf power index. So I do want you to notice a couple of things about this. Obviously, here A has half the power according to the Banzhaf power index, and B, C, and D have exactly all the same amounts of power. And that should be a little bit interesting because remember the weights were 18, I think 15, 6, and 4. So you might think just by the weights that, yeah, A and B are pretty close to the same idea, right? They're pretty close to the same, so allow the same power. But because the quota was 22, obviously A had a lot more power than B and C and D. And based on weight alone, you might think B is going to have more power than C. But obviously in this case we see that B and C and D all have the same amount of power, even though their weights are pretty different. So I want to change this, and all we're going to do is change the quota to 30 instead of 22. So push pause on the video and list all of the winning coalitions. All right, so hopefully you got all the winning coalitions. A and B is a winning coalition. Notice A and C is not, A and D is not, B and C is not. So that's the only winning coalition with 2 people in it. All right. With 3 people in it, obviously A, B, and C, and A, B, and D work. And if you look at A, C, D, A, C, D, that adds up to 28. So A, C, and D doesn't work. Okay. Same thing if I do B, C, and D. Basically, if your coalition is a 3-person coalition and it doesn't have A and B in it, A and B both, I should say, then it's not going to work, right? Because we need a quota of 30. The only way you can get that is with 3 players. Now, obviously, if you add up all 4 players, A, B, C, and D, by players, I mean voters, that is a winning coalition. So we had A, B as a winning coalition, A, B, C, A, B, D, and A, B, C, D. That was 4 winning coalitions. And now let's go through and see the critical count on each of these. Obviously, in A, this is critical, this is critical, this is critical, and this is critical. All right? In B, this, and this are critical. C is not critical in that, not critical, not critical, not critical. D is not critical, not critical, not critical, not critical. All right? So before we move on to the next slide, it's pretty clear that both A and B have critical counts of 4, and C and D have critical counts of 0. All right? So A and B, critical counts 4, 0, 0. Total weight is, the total number of the sum of critical sums, sum of critical counts is 8. And the Banzhaf power in this case is 4 and 8, 4 and 8, 0 out of 8, and 0 out of 8. Okay? And with the quota of 30, notice that again, here we had weights of 18, 15, 6, and 4. Okay? These were our weights. And so in this case, it does look like A and B basically share the power and everybody else gets left out. Okay? Whereas notice if you think about the 22 case, A had half the power and then B, C, and D were all evened out at the bottom. Okay? And this brings up a really interesting issue that quotas matter. All right? Quotas make a big difference on how much power somebody has. And with that idea, because quotas matter, if we are the people who are in charge of what I'll say rigging the system, we can manipulate how power works in a system. Now, you're never going to be able to give, well, let's take this example. Here we've given 51, 49, and 3 as our weights. And you're never going to be able to give C more power than A, but you could rig the system so C has as much power, or C has as much power as possible anyways. And you could rig the system so that, let's put it this way, C doesn't have very much power. Okay, so if you were A and B, maybe you want to rig the system so C doesn't have any power. If you're C, maybe you want to rig the system so you do have a lot of power. Okay. So let's do that. Let's pick a quota so that C has no power. All right. And basically we want C to never matter in a winning coalition. So what that means is we want to make the quota big enough so that this plus or minus 3, or this adding or subtracting 3 isn't going to make a difference. All right? So in this case, if you think about it, well, first off, 52 is sort of the minimum quota we can have, all right? If I make it 52, then A and C could combine together and meet the quota, which would give C some sort of power, and I don't want to do that. But if I make the quota something like 75, notice what's going to happen. Well, the winning coalitions are going to be A and B. That's a winning coalition. A and C don't work. B and C don't work. A, B, and C does work. Okay? But if you notice this, in this winning coalition, obviously C didn't matter. A, B, and C. So C is going to have a 0 when it comes to critical counts. So if I make my quota 75, C can always be dropped off of any winning coalition and not matter. All right? And that's what you kind of have to ask yourself when you're trying to manipulate these things. It's saying, well, what could the quota be so that if C is ever dropped off, it's not going to matter. Again, if you're trying to give C no power. And we could do the exact opposite. We could say that here we have this situation. By the way, the same minimum quota would be 52. When I say minimum quota, I mean if you add these things up, and divide by 2, you'll see that to get over 50%, you have to have 52. So if I want C to have the same power as A and B, well, what could we make our quota? Well, we should make it something that, adding C makes a difference. In fact, if you make the quota the minimum, then all of a sudden, your winning coalitions are, well, A and C works, A and B works, B and C works, and then the triple obviously works. All right? And notice in this last coalition, you can drop anything off. None of these are critical, right? If I drop off A, B, C still works. If I dropped off B, A, C still worked. If I dropped off C, A, B still worked. So this coalition where we have all of it, you're not going to get any sort of critical counts. So over here, if I drop off C from this one or this one, well, it is going to matter. So C is going to have a critical count of 2. And it turns out dropping off A from this guy or this guy leaves a critical count of 2. And dropping off B leaves a critical count of 2. So if you look at their critical counts here, they're all 2, 2, and 2. So C has exactly the same amount of power, which is 1/3 or 2 out of 6, as A and B do. All right. So you should be able to do some manipulations with the quotas to be able to manipulate power. All right. Now the last thing I wanted to just mention, and we're not going to do an example of this because it's just too long. If you're looking to go into manipulating and getting power, you can look into this further. But the Shapley-Shubik power index is another way to calculate it. Okay, now you're not going to get the exact same numbers as you did with the Banzhaf. All right, you will get slightly different numbers, and that's because sometimes power is a little bit subjective. All right, whether somebody was a critical player or critical player in a winning index isn't what we're looking at with the Shapley-Shubik. This uses winning sequences and pivotal positions. All right. Again, like I said, we're not going to do this in this class, but it is an interesting way to look at power, and it is viable. A lot of people look at this, especially when they assess political elections and things like that, or lots of other things. All right. So what I would expect you guys to do is to calculate the Banzhaf power index and be able to sort of pick a quota that either minimizes somebody's influence or maximizes somebody's influence, and those kinds of things. All right. You should have heard of the Shapley-Shubik, but again, I'm not going to test you over that.